Have you ever really thought about how we measure reading skills? It's actually way more fascinating than you might think. So today, we're going to break down the science of reading assessment, and we'll be using Chapter 8 of Language Assessment by Brown and Abewakrama as our guide.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big picture, what we call the landscape of reading. Then we'll dive into the 4 main types of reading. And finally, we'll get into the really practical stuff, how you actually design tests for all these different skills.
First things first, before you can even think about assessing reading, you got to understand the huge world of written stuff out there and all the different skills we use to make sense of it.
Right, so every text you read belongs to a genre, or các thể loại đọc, and all that means is a category of writing. Think about it. A recipe just doesn't look or feel the same as a novel, right? Each one has its own set of rules, and as readers, we kind of know what to expect, which helps us understand it faster.
You can basically lump all these different genres into 3 big buckets. First, you've got academic reading. That's your textbooks and research papers. Then there's job-related reading, all the emails, memos, and manuals. And finally, personal reading, which is pretty much everything else, from newspapers and novels to recipes and blogs.
Now, how we read is a really cool two-way street. We use what are called microskills, or VKinang, which is a bottom-up process. That's just recognizing the little things, letters, words, grammar. But at the exact same time, we're using macro skills, or VKinang, in a top-down way to get the bigger picture, like what the author is trying to do, or what the main idea is. You need both to be a great reader.
Okay, so with those skills in mind, we can actually classify the act of reading into 4 different types. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it's a progression. You start with perceptive reading, which is just seeing the letters and words. Then you move up to selective reading, where you're hunting for specific info. After that, it's interactive reading, where you're understanding short texts. And it all leads up to extensive reading, where you're grasping the entire meaning of really long texts. Each step builds on the last one.
Let's break those down a bit. Perceptive reading, or đọc nhận biết, is ground zero. It's the most basic level. This is all about just processing the symbols on the page, the letters, the punctuation, the words. It's the absolute foundation for everything else.
All right, the next step up is selective reading, or đọc lựa chọn. This is when you scan a text for something specific, like looking for a name, a date, or a particular verb in a sentence. You're not trying to understand the deep meaning. You're more like a detective looking for one specific clue.
Now we're talking. Interactive reading, or đọc đường text. This is where you're really starting to have a conversation with the text. It involves processing things like short articles or graphs to pull out the key information and actually remember it.
And that brings us to the top of the mountain, extensive reading, or đọc mở rộng. This is for longer texts like articles or even whole books. The goal here isn't just finding little details, it's about understanding the overall message, the main ideas, the whole shebang.
Okay, so that's the what. Now for the how. How in the world do you actually test for these different types of reading? Let's start with the basics, perceptive and selective reading.
When you're testing perceptive reading, you have to keep the task super focused. The whole point is just to confirm that the person can recognize the basic symbols of the language. That's it.
Because the goal is so simple, the tasks are very direct. We're talking about things like reading a word aloud, copying it down, or maybe using a picture, like matching the word cat to, a picture of a cat. It's very straightforward.
All right, moving on to selective reading. The assessments here get a little more complex. We're moving beyond just recognizing symbols and starting to focus on specific vocabulary and grammar within short texts.
So what does that look like? Well, you'll see things like multiple choice questions about vocab, or matching words to their definitions, or even filling in the blanks in a sentence. The key thing is that all these tasks ask you to find one specific language feature in a pretty small context. Okay, let's ramp up the difficulty. Now we're getting into the really integrated skills, which means testing how well someone can understand longer, more complex stuff. With interactive reading, the whole game changes. We're not just looking at words and grammar anymore. We're focused on meaning. So the tasks have to be designed to see how well someone can process and hold on to information from texts like paragraphs or charts.
The tasks here really make you put things together. This could be answering comprehension questions after you read a passage, writing short answers, or doing what's called information transfer, like reading a graph and then explaining what it means in your own words.
Oh, and then there's the classic close test, or bài tập điện tử vào chỗ trống. You've probably seen these before. They just take out a bunch of words from a paragraph and you have to fill them in. To do that, you have to use the context clues around the blank, which makes it a fantastic test of real comprehension.
And last but not least, how do we assess the big one, the ability to understand those long, complex texts? Well, tasks for extensive reading have to check for a global or big picture understanding.
So the crucial point here is that these tasks aren't about tiny details, they're about overall understanding. We're talking about things like skimming a long article to find the main idea, summarizing a chapter in your own words, or maybe creating an outline. These things show you can see the forest, not just the trees.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? It's that effective reading assessment is all about using the right tool for the job. It's about being precise. You can't measure someone's ability to understand a novel by asking them to match a word to a picture. You have to perfectly match the test to the skill you want to measure.
This video is brought to you by the IELTS Focus Zalo 0847 705 973, an English center specializing in IELTS preparation.